Hey, this is Trevor from Halifax, calling in to say that I support Creative Control on Patreon because I think long-form arts journalism is a crucial part of music culture, and there's simply not enough of it out there today. Vish is a master interviewer, he lands great guests, and he has his finger on the pulse of the ever-changing music landscape, both here in Canada and abroad. For all of these reasons and many more, I think you should support Creative Control on Patreon too.
To make your flexible monthly donation to Creative Control, please visit patreon.com/Creative Control today. I'm Vish's wife, and I will love him no matter what you do. And now he has me on the record saying that. This episode of Creative Control is brought to you by Pizza Trocadero, The Bookshelf, Planet Bean Coffee, and Granddad's Donuts, and is a panel discussion about the award-winning book, Tomorrow is Too Late, Toronto Hardcore Punk in the 1980s. It was recorded by and at the Toronto Reference Library before a live audience on Tuesday, July 23rd, 2019.
What I'd like to do is have each member of the panel introduce themselves one at a time, but I'd also like you to each think about your first encounter with Toronto hardcore punk. Whatever that was, a song, a show, someone telling you about it, whatever it was. I just want you to talk about how you first engaged with this culture that we're going to be talking about. This is a memory jog, so I'm stalling to give you all time. I'm just going to keep talking until you have your memories formulated. But yeah, so if you can state your name, your whatever affiliations you'd like to include, and then, like I say, first memories of punk, and we can go. Let's start with you, sir.
My name is Simon Harvey. I am one of the authors of the Toronto Hardcore book, and my first specific memory I'm going to come up with, I actually discussed with someone yesterday, so it comes to mind easily. My first Toronto Hardcore show, there were no Toronto groups playing, but it was DRI in Detroitson in 1986. And I strongly remember a gentleman in camouflage shorts and a shaven head with a T-shirt that said, "Oh Christ, it's the Crucifix," repeatedly smashing into my head at velocity from above. And yesterday I was looking at a book of pictures from the past and saw someone wearing the same T-shirt in 1986 and brought it all back. So it was a pretty vivid introduction to the vitality and noise and chaos of the whole thing.
Well, based on that experience, I'm glad you have any memory left at all.
Well, I primarily make them up.
You make them up, yeah. So what was it, beyond the horrible bruising that you took, what was it about the show that spoke to you? I'm just curious.
It's funny because I think about that sometimes, because the group that I was watching at the time were called Detroitson. They were from Madison, and at that point in their career had already become quite a bit stranger and quirkier and moved quite a bit away from the purest hardcore they used to play. And it blew my mind. I mean, the noise and energy and everything was just, it was an attack on the senses. Everything about it was overwhelming. But I wonder if jaded 48-year-old me would now look at that and think, they sound like Sonic Youth or something, But at the time, it was like nothing I'd ever experienced before in my life, maybe a little bit like standing behind a jet engine mixed with a rugby game, but nothing like that all at once, certainly before.
Do you have any recollection of what drew you to such an unprecedented event in your life? Like you hadn't experienced this before, so I just wonder, what was the circumstance that drew you there?
I suppose it's hard to pick a exact moment where I learned about that show or anything, but what brought me to having hardcore take a central role in my life would have been probably being around 10 years old in 1980, 1981 and listening to The Jam and The Clash on the radio and not having any idea what kind of music that was and just deciding I liked those songs, and a couple of years later borrowing a couple Clash records off a kid at school. I remember that specifically in 1985, March break of 1985, and bought London Calling by The Clash, and on my 15th birthday, which was September of 1985, I got the first Clash album, and my life just, spiraled into worse and worse music from then.
Well, I appreciate you being here, and thank you for your efforts with this book. How about a hand for Simon, everyone?
Thank you.
We move on.
I do. And I'm Sean Cherry, and I ran a zine and record label back in the 80s called Still Thinking with some high school friends, and I'm one of the co-authors. And I think my first exposure to punk was probably on TV, and it was likely City TV showing punk. That or the Tom Schneider show. I remember seeing that.
City Limits, probably?
City Limits, and even the New Music started
Right.
showing punk. And my first concert was I went to go see Triumph at the CNE, and Teenage Head opened, and I had heard Teenage Head on the radio, but seeing them live propelled me into my next concert after that was Devo at
Nice.
Massey Hall.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So Tom Schneider you bring up,
Yeah.
was very interesting, the booking that was going on
Oh,
that show.
totally.
This is the Tomorrow Show, right?
Yeah, and you'd see like Iggy Pop or the Ramones on there at like 1 a.m.
Right, so
What an 11-year-old was doing up at 1 a.m. is another story.
Are your parents here by
They're
chance?
not,
Should we,
but-
some guardians? Maybe we should be talking to them. Who did you see on the Tom Schneider show that struck your fancy?
Probably Iggy Pop, seeing him at his peak in like 79 or 80, going on what Iggy would do.
Yes,
Yeah.
shirtless,
and
wild performance.
No peanut butter.
No peanut butter at that time. And then engaging. What did you make of Tom Schneider's engagement with this subculture? Because he presented himself as this very. I mean,
He was very rigid and antagonizing.
in his own way. Yeah. Well, kind of, but I think curious about it.
He was
Less
he was.
judgmental, but like he just was like, "Where are you coming from? I need to know."
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it was TV.
TV, and then knowing that this stuff was here in the city.
But how did you know it was here?
I think mostly from City TV.
Just from TV.
Yeah.
Can you imagine? Like I knew about most things from Much Music growing
Yeah.
up in the 90s and the 80s and the 90s. And so that's how I knew about everything. And now that doesn't exist.
No.
Is there a substitute, do you think, currently? I guess the internet generally?
The internet and YouTube and
Yeah.
maybe Exclaim.
Exclaim Magazine,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So that's your memory.
That's my memory.
No one's going to question this. Is anyone unsure if Sean is correct here? No, this is right? Okay, Sean, thank you for being here again.
Thank you.
Then we'll move down. You, sir.
Hey, one of our panelists just showed up. It's awesome. Hey, it's Doug.
Hey, Doug.
How's it going, Doug?
It's a trend. We're showing up late. I'm sorry again.
You're here. Okay, so I'm Derek Emerson, and again, one of the co-authors of this book. I came at things a little bit differently, I guess, from more the hard rock, heavy metal side of things. So as a kid in the late 70s growing up, and then my first concert is Kiss, and you're seeing, whoever, Rush and Queen and all these bands of the day. I guess by the early 80s, I kind of got jaded with just, the big stadium kind of stuff, and I started to look for similar kind of music, but a little bit more underground, aggressive. So bands so I started tape trading. So that was a big thing in my life, was sending out tapes to people in California and England and Europe, wherever, and finding out what...
Just to follow up on that, just for 1 second. Are you just sending these to random people? How do
No,
you find
so
people
the way
to
it
mail
worked,
stuff to?
Well, the way it worked back then was there were fanzines and there were magazines like Metal Forces, Kerrang, things like that on the metal
Right.
side. And they had, in the back of the magazine, they'd have these classified ads, and it'd be like the pen pal ads, right? And so a lot of the people that actually became influential in the metal scene later on, that's how they started meeting and networking with all these people. And bands that are the biggest bands in the world, like Metallica, their demo got circulated around, and that's how the underground, that's how they built their base, right? And it was, not just people, but people like me that were just saying, this band's interesting, and then sending it to someone somewhere else, and they'd do another copy, and the copy would get around. But bringing it more to a local focus. So I was tape trading with all these people, and I was listening to primarily metal, but then I started, you're into Motorhead or whatever. It's not really that big of a leap into Discharge, right? Mm-hmm. And then you're just kind of like, okay, this is now I'm listening to punk, and it's not that different. It's still aggressive. I didn't actually even really see the lines between those things as something like, I can't listen to that, or I have to listen to this. Like, it just seemed natural to listen to both types of music.
But you bring the lines up because there was that delineation.
There were lines, but it didn't faze me, and the crossover wasn't a thing yet. But I just didn't really see them as a barrier, a barrier to entry. But more specifically about the local bands. So there was a record store called Record Peddler, which I'm sure most people in the room know, and we're spend half their lives there digging through the bins.
But for people who may be listening to this from around the world, because it is being recorded for a podcast, can you explain the significance? What is Record Peddler? What was the significance of Record Peddler?
Okay, so Record Peddler was an independent store started in the late 70s by two partners, and their goal was to basically service a niche here that the sort of a little bit more mainstream stores like a Sam's or Records on Wheels. Records on Wheels wasn't really mainstream, but they didn't go deep into extreme forms of music. Whereas Record Peddler, that was their mandate, was to find these really obscure records. They had people like that they had contacts that would go over to England, bring them back suitcases full of magazines and records and things that you just weren't getting here. And then Ben thought, Ben Hoffman was one of the partners. He thought, why don't we start to distribute this stuff here to even some of the other stores, like Records on Wheels would buy things from them, and they started doing distribution to small stores across Canada, and they grew this sort of distribution network, but it was really grassroots.
It was literally a record peddler.
It was. They were peddling records
to the other
and the
stores.
name is interesting. In the book, there's a little anecdote that how they came up with the name, because prior to starting Record Peddler, Ben Hoffman was a drug dealer. He was peddling drugs.
Makes sense.
And so he'd been busted for that and whatever. And then he thought, you know what, I'm going to go legit and I'm going to start to peddle records now. So it became the Record Peddler.
I see.
So the idea was, you guys probably remember the logo that they used was a guy on his bike. That was actually a mistake. When Ben was explaining the concept to the artist, he said, I want it to be a record peddler. I'm peddling records instead of drugs. So he wanted it to be a guy with opening his trench coat, and instead of having drugs or, whatever, wristwatches or whatever, he would have records inside his trench coat. That's what it was supposed to be, but the artist misunderstood and then it just kind of went with it. But anyway, finding out about Record Peddler was the life-changing moment for me.
Just finding out about the store.
Finding out about the store because it led to so many other things. And specifically your question about, the local bands. That's where we found like demos by Direct Action and Chronic Submission and Sudden Impact and all these bands. And then you start realizing this stuff's happening right here. Like I got to start to dig into this a bit more, right? So I kind of was still listening to the old school metal stuff and tape trading and doing all that, but I was also getting those tapes from Record Peddler and sending those out into the world and trying to say, hey, you know what? Because a lot of people elsewhere just thought that we lived in igloos. Like the reality, like for real, they were just like, I can't believe you have power. You know what I mean? I get these kind of records or these notes from people when you'd send them out these recordings. And so, anyway.
It's because of SCTV. It's because of Bob and Doug.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to try and cut the story short, but basically, I sent out those tapes, and I always felt like there could have been more. There should have been more recognition of the bands that some of the people in this room were in. Yeah. And they never got it back then. And so that was why Sean and I first started talking about doing this book. We're just like, this is fucked up. Like, there needs to be a recognition of this stuff out there. And so it was important to us to have the record come with it as well so that the music could actually get out into the world, even though, you can find it on the internet now. We wanted them to, a lot of these bands didn't have a proper vinyl release back then, and we were just like, this is important to us, so we wanted it to come with a record, the original pressing, and we wanted all these bands to finally get their due.
I want to follow up with you. It might come up later in conversation, but that delineation you were talking about in terms of being a metal fan versus getting into hardcore and punk, I just wonder about the social delineation as well. Because it sounds like you were interacting with people around the world about this culture you cared about, and I want to figure out how that, you being a metal guy, getting into hardcore, how that manifested itself in your immediate surroundings and region. But again, do you think this is going to come up as we go?
Probably will, yeah, about crossover and how the scenes kind of melded together.
Yeah, I just wonder.
I guess just to touch on it, it was, at first, we had long hair and we were going to punk shows. People gave us the look.
Yeah.
But I think that in Toronto, at least, there wasn't that sort of pushback of like, you don't belong here. It's like, okay, well, you must be here for a reason, and as long as you're not causing trouble, like, we'll see how this goes. It was that kind of a,
right.
we were getting tested of whether or not, how true we were into this music,
Right.
And there was no violence or anything.
Judgmental
No judgment,
stuff.
no
Okay.
judgments, no violence, no anything, none of that stuff that we really perceived. And it was pretty quick. It was only a matter of handful of shows, and people thought, you know what, we can live with this. To some people, that whole crossover thing becomes a little bit muddier as the 80s go on, and the bands and the music just kind of became more generic and whatnot, but that's a different matter.
Well, Derek, I appreciate the introduction and the context. How about a hand for Derek, everyone? Fran?
So my name is Fran Grasso, and I'm one of the book team, just helped with the interviews and transcribing. My intro to punk, when I was a kid, I just kind of, new immigrant, came here when I was 5 from Italy, never really quite fit in, so I was always looking for something. And when I found the Sex Pistols on the radio, I used to listen to CFMY when it was, more interesting. There was Sex Pistols and a lot of British punk. So that was kind of my intro. And then when the Exploited were playing a show here, that was my first show. Was
you saw the Exploited? Wow.
Yeah.
Where was that?
I think it was the Bridge.
Okay.
Yeah, Ildikos.
July 4th, 87.
Okay.
And open
Yeah.
for
Well done.
them.
Simon just gave the date. What did you say? What did you say the date was?
I only know it was July 4th because it's American Independence Day, and this is far from one of my favorite groups, but they are well known for a song that is less than entirely approving of the United States. So.
Worth noting that. Were you at the show as well?
I was, yes.
Did you know Fran?
I don't think we met. at
Maybe
that time, yeah.
we probably did within months. Knew each
Yeah,
other.
yeah.
Okay, cool.
But
Sorry.
yeah, so that was one of my.
So CFNY, this is interesting. Now,
Yeah.
two people have brought up media outlets that sort of still exist, that used to be good, and now aren't. I
Yeah.
mean, did you, when growing up you were only 5 when you came over, you were saying?
Yeah.
So you weren't really in touch with, like, punk scenes in Italy, per se, or
no.
underground music. Okay, so
No.
you came here, but this music spoke to you. What were you into before that, though?
I came from more of the new wave stuff. I had subscriptions to like some British magazines. So there was a lot of British new wave and punk that I was looking at. But then after I started going to shows, I kind of got off of the British stuff and more onto the American, local punk and hardcore bands.
Why'd you get off the British stuff, if I might ask?
It was a bit too maybe political in a way I couldn't relate at that time.
Are you
and also the hair and it was just all like just too much for me. at that
Fashion-y?
time. Yeah.
So you got off, are you including the Pistols in that?
Yes.
The Pistols, Clash, Damned, like you, or whoever, you were just like, no.
I just like the Black Flag and all the American hardcore and
Okay.
of course MSI
Right.
and local bands.
You just motioned with your hand when you said MSI. What were you referencing?
Derek.
Derek, you
Yeah.
were,
I played guitar in a band called MSI,
right.
and we actually opened for that Exploited show.
Oh, weird.
As well.
Oh, okay, cool.
Since that was
I
Now,
didn't
did,
know him
It's a
then.
joke because they were straight edge.
Yeah,
right,
yeah. We got put on the bill by Brian Taylor.
right.
He got us somehow on that bill because we were a straight edge band, which means no drinking, no drugs, that
I'm
kind of
straight
thing.
edge still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just in case the audience doesn't know, though, that's
Yeah.
a straight edge band. So he got us put on that bill because he thought that we would probably get injured and get stuff thrown at us and whatever.
Seems like a good Brian Taylor
It was a bit
prank.
of a joke,
Yeah.
and then as a return joke, we said, "Yeah, we'll take that show," and we did it. And it turned out that Waddy was actually really super nice to us, and
Oh, nice.
yeah, he one of our friends actually got killed by a drunk driver a couple days before, and earlier that day was his funeral. And so we came directly from, like, basically a lot of the hardcore scene was at that funeral, and we came directly from there to the show. So there was a lot of rage and kind of angst and, a lot of pissed off kids because of this situation that had just happened. And we had sort of told Waddy the story before the show. And, he was very sympathetic and, oh, I'm really so sad to hear about your friend. And Scott Williams was his name. He was a guitarist for another band called Death of Gods. And anyways, so we play our set, and then, there were a couple other bands after us. Dr. No played, and maybe that was it, actually. But anyways, another band played, and then the Exploited comes on. And halfway through their set, Waddy dedicated a song to our friend Scott and recounted the story to the crowd, and we're just like, wow, that guy actually, like, he didn't have to give a shit. You know what I mean? Like, he was high as a kite, I'll say that. He was coked up, and he had women all over him, and, like, just a lot of distractions. But just the fact that he went on stage and recounted that story and gave a shit about our situation really meant something.
It's a sweet story. I've never heard distractions used in such a way, but that's a nice story. Well, Fran, we segued from Fran. Did you two meet at the show, Fran? Do you remember?
No,
But
no.
do you remember
No, we
seeing
met
MSI?
later.
Did you remember seeing MSI?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. All right. Fran, thank you so much, and how about a hand for Fran?
My name is Steve Perry, and I'm a co-host for a radio show here in Toronto called Equalize and Distort. And I did a number of other things. I did a fanzine and did a tape label and a record label called Ragamuffin Soldier, sang in a band called One Blood, sang in a band called Countdown to Oblivion, did a bunch of different things. But we also, we first started doing a radio show at York called Fast and Bulbous on the Spot, which I want to thank Mike Kanzi for being my co-partner in that. He was in Sons of Ishmael, and I wasn't brave enough to try and do one myself, so Mike was a good partner in crime for that. But my first, so I want to sort of approach this a little differently because I do think that there's a media angle to it. The first time I was exposed to punk rock was at Estonian summer camp, and
as you would be.
Yeah, it sounds like an unusual starting point.
Yeah.
The kid who so we were in barracks, and the kid who had brought his stereo equipment so that we could all listen to records and stuff on was into punk rock, and so at the time hated it. But was being slowly exposed to it and learning about it, and then starting to develop a taste for it. And later in life, I was asking him about what his sources were for finding music, as lots of us nerds do. And he was telling me, because he lived on a farm, so it was kind of unusual for a punk rocker to be coming out of sort of a farming agricultural community. And he was saying, yeah, I was listening to CFRU, so the Guelph station.
Whoa, weird.
And he was listening to, I think, the Kitchener station, which maybe was CKMS, or I'm not sure.
There was CKWR, was there? Anyway, there's a...
Maybe it was that one.
Yeah, anyway.
And, you could listen to these radio stations, and you could actually get a phone call in, and they would probably actually play a request. And then they would shout you out over the radio, so it would be a kick to hear your name on the radio. Anyway, that's sort of how he started learning about all these punk rock bands, and he had a great collection, and that's kind of how I went. So my first show was the Boomtown Rats at the Seneca College, but I don't know if that's sort of hardcore enough for this book. However,
they were pretty angry at Mondays.
Yeah, they hated Mondays.
Yeah.
And B.B. Gabor opened up. Anyway,
Sorry, where was that show?
That was at Seneca College, and it was actually pretty close to where I lived, grew up in North York.
Oh, okay.
So it was easy for me to get to. I could still not tell my parents where I was going and still get out to the show. I think I was 13 or 14 at the time. And, so I was terrified going to that show. And, seeing kids with safety, there's a kid with a safety pin through her cheek, and I'm like, man, I got to do that? It's going to take some convincing, right? Anyway, I think there was a few hardcore shows that I started going to. I went to Larry's, and I went to one of the Black Flag shows at the Party Center. But the first show that really kind of clinched it for me was DOA at the Upper Lip, and that it was kind of like what Simon was talking about, where there's sort of a familiarity with that War on 45 single, the 12-inch that was available in a lot of places. Was one of the first records I bought, and just be able to sing along to these songs, seeing it being played live, and there was just it was just a feeling of belonging. So that was what clinched it for me. And then they did this crazy. I keep mentioning this story to a lot of people. I don't think people will ever confirm that this story happened, but I totally remember them doing a cover of "Singing in the Rain" as an encore, and people just started gobbing in the air. And it started raining, and I thought, gross but funny,
Was it a?
It was hilarious.
Was it a faithful cover of the song? Were they doing it?
Yeah, it was pretty. I mean, it was like a sped up version. It's like a punk version, like how you'd hope somebody in a punk scene would do.
Okay.
But just the sense of humor to it. It was just, and how it just sort of came spontaneously to people. This idea. I thought, there's so much creativity in this scene, right? There's so much to this scene. So anyway,
I appreciate that. And did you plug your show? You did sort of mention your radio show. You're still doing one.
I still am, yes. Equalizing the Start, which Simon and I started at CIUT back in 1999, I sort of moved from CHRY up at York down there, and Simon was being sort of approached by the program director at the time, and I'm like, Simon, let's team up and do a show. And he came up with the name, and we sort of came up with the idea of the show, and it's been going ever since.
And what is your role in this book?
I did a bunch of interviews, and I think maybe I could be credited for we had a blog that we're posting up flyers and different events for, and Sean and Derek had seen it and said, when they were coming up, I think they'll tell the story about how the idea for the book
Yeah,
came up.
sure.
But, we were all of the same mind that this was a scene that hadn't been covered and definitely deserved its due, and it was long overdue.
Well, I appreciate the introduction. How about a hand for Steve as well, please, everyone? Thank you. Oh, yeah, sorry.
We'll introduce Doug as well.
We have another panelist. Sorry, I forgot about that. Do you want to? Is there room? Can he join us?
Yeah, the club that the show that we were talking about earlier, The Exploited.
Yeah.
That took place at a club called Ildico's, and it went under 3 different names actually over a period of 2.5 years. But it was a very important club in Toronto's punk history. It started out as the Starwood, then it became the Bridge, and then it became Ildico's. But it was all in the same building. Doug is the gentleman that ran that club.
Welcome, Doug. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So,
Yeah, my name is Douglas Galbraith. In 1984, we opened a club on Bloor Street, 507 Bloor, with my Hungarian partner. And we started with different kind of music altogether. It was Latin and ballroom, dance music and all that. That didn't work, so we changed the whole format. We changed the color of the facilities all into black, and we had hardcore bands featured there, and we had quite a few. We had Bunch of Fucking Goose and Sudden Impact and Suicidal Tendencies, and these bands were awesome because what they all had followers. So we'd advertise in the Now newspaper and to say what bands are playing and what times, and they would show up. And some bands would bring like 50 people. We had 4 bands, like jam sessions, about 3 to 4 nights a week. So, it was, they drank a lot of beer and there was a lot of music, and we need diversity. That's the whole thing. And this is what's really working now with the world in general and everything, diversity. And the bands were very, awesome. They were just awesome. Yeah.
Doug, can you take us back to that moment in time and what compelled you to make a place for these bands? Like you mentioned, altering this space, but what was it about the music that... you mentioned they had a following, and, that's great. But what was it? What was it about the music that spoke to you?
Well, we had... the ballroom dancing wasn't working well. They don't drink. So,
the ballroom
they
dance,
just pay the admission, and the music's great, but and the atmosphere was nice, but you can't make money just with no bar working. So
you can't be tipsy ballroom dancing. You have to be sure-footed.
So a couple of individuals, Enzo and the other chap, I forget his name now.
Sean Pilot?
Yeah, introduced to Ildico and said, why don't you, they said to her, why don't we try some different kind of entertainment, hardcore. And she said, okay, let's try it, And that's when we painted everything black and, did everything. And they started coming, the bands, and they had followers, and this is it. We did more with the hardcore bands, with customers coming in, than we did with the Latin ballroom.
So it was sort of a business decision, really.
Yes.
You were trying to keep the venue going.
We were trying to keep it going, yeah.
Right.
The rent was quite high at that time. It was $5,000 a month back in '84, and that was a kind of a tidy sum.
Right.
And she was a high school teacher in the daytime, and I was selling shoes.
Right.
But
for the ballroom dancers? No, probably not for them.
No.
That's an amazing aspect of punk, is that it ends up in churches, church basements, people just trying to make the rent,
right,
making a space for them. So you were doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Did you grow to like the music?
At first I didn't, but then I got to like it. It's funny, eh? Yeah, no, because people were having a good time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when you have a jam session with all different bands, you have so much variety.
Right.
So you get the flavor, It's really great, yeah. And we had a big space, 5,000 square feet, so you can imagine it was a big floor. The stage was elevated at the one end, and the bands could perform up on the stage, and it was just great. And so what happened from that, they looked at me up a few years ago, a year or two ago, because they said, were you the people that operated the bridge? And I said, yeah. And then we got in contact. But what happens is they wanted me to MC the bands because they remembered me, that they were so happy to be playing there, you know. And
well, just to go back a little bit, during the original days of the bridge, Doug would get on stage and introduce these bands. So, and he would do it in this sort of like Vegas showmanship sort of style, right? He'd be dressed up, and there'd be all these punk kids with their ripped up clothes, and Doug would be there in a velour leisure suit or something. He'd be like, "Ladies and gentlemen, the bunch of fucking goofs." And we're like, it's like we were one of the only scenes on the planet probably that had their own punk MC.
That's amazing.
And
he'd play bongos too.
And he played bongos. Yeah. But back with the soundboard, the bands are playing, he's playing bongos. We're just like, this guy's got something going on.
You would play bongos while the bands were playing hardcore music?
The odd time, but not all the time.
But one of the first shows there was Johnny Thunders played when it was still the Starwood, and Sean Pilot put it on. And the fellow who owned Lee's Palace, it had been a club at one point in the late 70s, early 80s, and then he saw the lineup out the door for this Johnny Thunders gig, and it inspired him to open up Lee's Palace again.
Wow. Okay. So
that's right.
That is okay.
And just speaking from the point of view of a band from that period of time, if Doug hadn't have done what he and his partner Ildiko had done, I don't know that our band would have existed or any of the bands at that point, because punk wouldn't have had a home in the city. And I don't think Doug probably at the time, like he wanted to sell beer. He wanted to, it was a livelihood. But I don't think he understood until we got in touch with him about the book, like how many people's lives he impacted.
Exactly.
And it was amazing to be able to reach out to him after all these years, after 30 years, and say, you know what you did was very important, and this book is a document about a lot of that period, and it's because he did what he did at the time.
Are you feeling more appreciated now, Doug?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Doug, I mean,
more appreciated.
Underground culture is populated by a lot of unsung heroes who do the kind of work you did. So I just want to say, on behalf of all punks and all people, thank you for your efforts in this city and for opening it up and being open-minded, because it's amazing that you did this. Thank you. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you very much.
All right.
I just wanted to say that we had a record release show for this book.
Yes.
And we invited Doug, and he emceed the bands, and he introduced them, and it was amazing.
Do you still fit in the velour suit? I know that sounds seedy. You were just dressed like that? Okay. Casual? Okay. Well, it's amazing. It's amazing. Yeah. So we have talked about, thank you everyone for introducing yourself, first of all, but we've talked about a few people, and this book is a cavalcade of names and lots of different bands. But you have all kind of talked about the material conditions of Toronto in some way, and I think that's worth discussing to take us back to what was available to bands, to fans. We've talked about Doug here and the fact that he opened up this space for bands. Can someone, maybe Derek, maybe Sean, maybe anyone, talk a little bit about what it was actually like in Toronto at the time that this scene was blossoming and coming up, politically, socially, culturally? Is that worth talking about, do you think, and how it impacted Toronto hardcore? Sean?
I'm thinking I interviewed Daniel Richler from the New Music, and he was a guy who came here from being in the UK, and he said, all I remember was Toronto being super bleak, and that you basically would get on the streetcar and go to places. So you were going to a friend's house or you're going to a venue. And I thought, I lived here my whole life. I lived in the city, and it was a bleak, gray, depressing place with not a lot of outlets. And it was really going to these shows or going to the record peddler was our community.
It's bad when someone from England says we're bleak.
Yes. Yeah, it struck me because he had this outside view, and I went, oh my God, he's right. This place was horrible.
So what years are we talking about?
But I want to say something. Yeah. I think a lot of us came from suburbs.
Yeah.
And that was sort of the model of pre-planned kind of building and structures, and there was no fun in that, even though they were trying to build fun into it. And I think a lot of us were looking for adventure in some ways. Or like for a place to belong. So it was kind of, there was also this boredom in our lives that and looking for a place to belong. And I mean, because I came from North York, and there was nothing going on there. And downtown, there was lots of amazing, interesting people and things to do. And I think there was this absence of culture in the surrounding area that sort of pushed me into hardcore.
Yeah, I think that also as a kid, and like Steve said, you're looking for some adventure. There's a sense of danger, right? You're going to a club and you're 14, 15 years old, and you've got these veterans like Doug, that have been working clubs, and they're like these older guys that are and even the people in your own scene that are 4 or 5 years older. It's like a lifetime difference when you're that age, and there's an element of fear and danger and not knowing what's going to happen, but then you get into the atmosphere and you just go like, yeah, everybody's fine here. It's it was a pretty relatively safe environment. But at first, that was one of the things that sort of attracted me, was this like, you don't know what you're getting into. Going to places like Larry's Hideaway or the DMZ when it was on Spadina, and it's run by the Goofs, right? And the Goofs were kind of viewed as a gang, I guess, at that point or whatever. And they're a few years older than you, and you're like, this is a little bit scary, and what's going to happen here? There's an element of danger and surprise and all of that, and it kind of, got your adrenaline going as a kid.
Where you could get it for free at one of their shows if you brought a TV down for their song pre-programmed. You could
bring it,
get it for $1 off for bringing a graffiti tool at the DMZ. It was a punk run club. There was so many amazing things going on within that scene that how could you not want to, like, it was just so different from what you were growing up in.
Well, you grew up in the suburbs, though, right? You were saying.
Well, all of us, I'm looking
Did
at
everybody?
This panel, all
Well,
of
it
us
depends what you mean by
pretty
suburbs. I mean, you were in North York.
You were in Scarborough.
I was in Scarborough.
Mississauga.
I mean, we were in the city. You'd hop on the bus. It wasn't like we lived in
Guelph?
No. But it wasn't.
Who lives there?
We lived in Oakville or
I
Whitby.
sensed a burn coming, so
But,
I headed it off.
But it was,
fast.
you, as I'm sure you're well aware, I mean, even 30 years ago, we didn't have Sunday shopping. There were parts of the city that were still dry.
Right.
I mean, it was certainly a much more monochromatic sea of faces if you were riding the bus or whatever. Lots of things have changed pretty dramatically, and maybe not drastically overnight, but over the course of several decades. And at the time, I think there was always an undercurrent of violence. There was always gangs and stuff. When you read about, brawls between Nazis and anti-fascists at baseball diamonds in Toronto in the 30s. I mean, there's always been violence and danger and crime if you go to search it out. But I think that the day-to-day life, if you mind your own business and stay in your residential neighborhood, was maybe not as exciting back then, and punk definitely made it easier to seek excitement out.
Well, it's interesting that I asked about kind of material conditions of the city at the time, and violence has come up. So violence was a factor in everyday life in Toronto. Is that what you're saying? I mean, it is still to this day, but was it feeling
we didn't have like these summer of the gun things.
Right,
I mean, I don't remember. I mean, I remember people being murdered and so on, the things that would make the news, but I also wonder if things that made the news now wouldn't even make the news.
Well, in the book, and it's well documented on some level that when the Ramones first came to town, everybody started a band after that. So I guess what I'm getting at, and I know it's impossible to pinpoint exactly where this particular sound came from, but I wonder if it's drawing from some mood in the city, I guess is what I'm getting at. When you're talking about Toronto hardcore. And by the way, we've discovered it could equally be called Greater Toronto Hardcore, couldn't it? I mean, it's a lot of suburban kids. I myself would come into Toronto for shows.
But there was certainly some downtown. I mean, our entry point is like, I think, a generation back from the first or second wave of the hardcore scene. But I'm thinking of bands like the Young Lions who were looking at, in some of the interviews that we did, they were looking at, so they felt that they were sort of at a perfect intersection between America and the UK, and so Canada had a bit of both. They were taking like some of the melodic sounds of the UK punk scene, and they were taking some of the speed that was associated with the American hardcore scene, and they were marrying the two together, right? And so that's kind of how you start seeing the scene start sounding the way it sounds, right? They start playing faster, they start playing more political. Everything was more. It was just a little bit of everything more. Everything was amping up. So, and the time wasn't great. Like, I mean, we did talk about the bleakness of it, and I think there was, there was a neocon revolution going on within politics at the time, like Reagan, Thatcher, Brian Mulroney. We had Mulroney, so you had that. And whether it was the residue or whether we were right in it, we were still dealing with the policies that were being put in place by those people. So you had reason to be pissed off. And you were looking for something. I just think there was a lot of things going on at the time. I also think that some of these places, like some of these clubs, require a bunch of entrepreneurship where you get people who are willing to take risks. Like Doug was talking about, he had to take a risk, right? Things weren't working out. Some of these places were old man bars, like people talk about the Turning Point being an old man bar before that, and then sort of taking a risk with some of these punk bands because they could sell more beer. I mean, it was
became
just
the learning point, right? That's what people started to call
that's
it. Yeah,
affectionately, right?
Yeah.
But there was a lot of places like that were taking place in, like I remember the second DMZ was Blondie's. It was kind of like a little bit further out and a little bit north of Bloor, which, God forbid, it's north of Bloor, right? It wasn't in the central business district. But the reason why it was there was probably because it was cheaper, right? And
Sure.
You could make something of it. So some of these things required an entrepreneur. Like there's a lot of factors that go into making some of the recipe for how this scene started evolving. And that's sort of the city part of it. Like you're sort of asking a specific question about the city part of it. I'm thinking part of it does require lower rents and a person who's willing to take a risk and some of those things.
Yeah, I think I'm actually equally interested in the lyrical content. You, by the way, started to characterize the sound of Toronto hardcore, which I think I appreciate. Maybe people who are listening to this and people here tonight might appreciate this.
I mentioned the Young Lions because every time I started, like when I think at that point I was doing a radio show and we were learning about the scene before us, everyone pointed to the Young Lions.
Right.
And I would say that, Youth were one of my favorite hardcore bands of the whole lot. Like listening to their music, going back to it, I still just get super excited when I hear them play.
Has anyone seen the SCTV skit, The Queen Haters? That's the Young Lions.
They wrote those songs, and played them. Right.
Well, it's literally the Young Lions, is what you mean. Yeah.
It wasn't the SCTV people.
I don't think there's a Toronto hardcore sound, though. There were lots of different.
That's what I want to get at. Yeah,
there wasn't.
There wasn't really. Okay.
No.
But that was what was great about Toronto, right?
Well, I mean, there was lots of different kinds of punk bands.
Yeah.
But I think too, we talk about the violence and so on, and there's a sort of received wisdom with pretty much every punk history in the world, where everyone says how first wave punk was all art school and it was a lot of queer content and women involved and it was all interesting and culturally vital, and then hardcore comes along and it's this sort of blur of noise.
Yeah.
It wasn't like that.
I know. Yeah.
And what's more, in Toronto, you look at the first generation of 70s punk, it was really violent. Not everybody. I wasn't there. But you talk to people who were, and you keep hearing about the Blake Street Boys and all this kind of, guys like Nazi Dog. I mean, no one was calling themselves Nazi Dog
there was a real,
like 10 years later.
That's right. There was a real marriage of fascism and
well,
music.
I don't think it was real fascism.
No, but it was like a weird...
But this is something I think that goes over, gets left out of this a lot.
Shock fascism.
Well, beyond that, though, there's two different kinds of rebellion we're talking about here.
Yeah.
We talk about these conservative governments coming in around, which I certainly wouldn't call neoconservative, but conservative governments coming in around 1980. And so in the 70s, you've got punk rock, and the rebellion isn't, again, I mean, the 50s to the 70s are economically and culturally quite vital and healthy in the Western world.
Yes.
And I mean, we have the OPEC crises and so on, but generally, life gets better.
Right.
Society improves. And so punk is a cultural rebellion. It's a rebellion against hippies and the Grateful Dead and your parents smoking pot and, people having long hair. So things like Nazi Dog, I mean, it's moronic. I don't approve of it. But the context is offending people who were supposed to be the rock and roll rebels a generation earlier.
Right.
There's no real great political content to much 70s punk at all.
What about Toronto hardcore, though? Because
this is what I'm going to say. So then in 1980, the music becomes a lot heavier, music becomes a lot more violent, and the lyrics become a lot more serious. And there's a lot less you still have dumb knee-jerk, pseudo-reactionary shock value stuff. But you also have, your Dead Kennedys and your MDCs and so on. And I think that Toronto certainly reflects that.
Yeah.
Once again, I wasn't there in the early 80s, so I'm a little reticent to be telling people what the early 80s were like. But by the late 80s, or the mid 80s, it's much more ideological. It's much more specifically political. People aren't worried so much about offending hippies. There's people in this room that were in groups like Sons of Ishmael that were writing songs about the global arms trade, or austerity programs, and the IMF in forcing developing countries to cut social programs. These are the sort of things that bands are singing about. You don't get that in the 70s.
No.
And this flies completely counter to the usual sort of part-timer narrative about this stuff.
So I want to go to Fran for a moment, just because, Fran, you were saying that you kind of jettisoned some of the British punk because of the politics and that you couldn't really relate to what they were talking about. Does the Toronto, like the stuff that Simon was just talking about, could you relate to that more? Were you aware of that?
I could, just because I guess it was more relevant to me, like singing about Thatcher and things that weren't, in my day-to-day life, I couldn't relate to.
Right.
But for sure, the politics here and just, whatever was happening at that time, that's a different thing. And I think that's why I was so, the British punk scene was what got me into the music, but then the lyrics and stuff I just couldn't relate to after a while, and I could relate more to the American and Canadian
I
stuff.
see. So it wasn't that they were being political, it was just like you couldn't relate to their politics, right? It wasn't
exactly.
your politics. So when Toronto hardcore bands started to sing about regional politics, national politics, that resonated with you?
Yeah.
Okay, okay. Sean, are there particular woodshed moments for Toronto hardcore? I mentioned the Ramones coming to town, and that changing the culture on some level in terms of punk. What about hardcore?
We have a couple sections in there where we have sort of key gigs that happen,
Yeah.
and most of them were big bands coming here. So it wasn't. We still looked at the outside bands as the important things happening. And the first one that we talk about as the starting point really was an event that happened at City Hall. That was this anti-Nuke event, and DOA's playing, and the rest of the bands are all first wave 70s Toronto punk bands. And, swastikas show up, and all the stupid stuff from the 70s punk is there, and
Pro-Nuke chants.
Chants, and DOA's the only thing. And DOA had been in the city previously. They tried to make a go of it in the late 70s here, and then they come back, and they're sort of the ones that breathe life. Because I think Toronto was probably late to starting hardcore bands. I think we were listening to hardcore bands. And the big one was, there was 2 Dead Kennedy shows at the concert hall about 8 months apart. And the first one, it's first wave bands opening. So Les Étrangers, Andrew Cash's band and Charlie Angus's band is opening, and Screaming Sam. And then the second time, it's Youth and Young Lions opening.
Right.
So we know, that's, from the Record Peddler, we knew people were listening to hardcore, but people weren't forming hardcore bands right away at the beginning of the 80s.
Right.
Yeah.
So the Dead Kennedys were significant in particular. Okay.
And they only played here those 2 times, and that was it.
And that second show is sort of like, people talk about that Ramones show that happened in England where everybody started a band. We kind of heard that from a lot of people that were at that second Dead Kennedy show, where this went, wow, seeing Young Lions, seeing Youth, seeing Dead Kennedys, it's like, I could start a band. And then kids went away and kind of did.
You started seeing these themes. Sorry to interject, but I was thinking that the day after had shown on TV.
The Steve Guttenberg movie with the nuclear holocaust?
Right, and people were legitimately scared, right? And there was also this feeling like there was no tomorrow, and we had to sort of try and make the world a better place a little bit. And so people got active, and you started seeing, so you were talking about the Rock Against Nuke. There was the Rock Against Racism. There was Rock Against Reagan. So there was quite a few Rock Against types of things that started happening, and that was, I think, that's when you're starting to see punk and start to define itself, I guess, in a post-punk way as hardcore. So one of the punk things that come out is hardcore, and there's a lot of other types of punk that start coming out, but hardcore was one of those things. And I think it was just, like I said, as a characterization, it was amped up everything, ideas, music,
right?
And activism.
I just want to touch upon something Sean said, though, about how we were talking about the Ramones and the Dead Kennedys, and how it might have been that Toronto bands were waiting for those bands to come to town before figuring out they could do it? Like that kind of sound, maybe? Is that a Canadian trait? Is that something that we're just waiting? No. What do you think, Simon?
Well, DOA was, I mean, no one starts cultural movements. No one starts a form of music. But I'd say if there is, to the extent that there is a Canadian hardcore sound, DOA epitomizes it, and Youth, and Young Lions in Toronto are in the same mold. And it is a sort of a combination, perhaps, of the speed and heaviness of the American stuff and maybe the melodic sense of the British stuff. But no, I mean, DOA was out there before anybody. You know, DOA and Black Flag and Dead Kennedys pretty much formed the blueprint for this stuff, and so I can't say that. I don't know what it is about Toronto. I think one thing you'll hear from DOA is that they came here, as Sean said, actually as the Skulls in 1977, lived here for a while, and their sense was that in Toronto, everyone wanted to be New York. Everyone wanted to wear leather pants and have, and these guys didn't care about that at all. They, it's way more of a West Coast kind of slack, casual look, play fast, who cares what your hair looks like kind of thing. I guess I tend to fall halfway in between, but I appreciate it.
And they had been burned, like when they were trying to fit into the scene. They had moved here to try and make it as the Skulls. And they didn't fit in because of those, like the types of dress that they had. They didn't have the same kind of thrift shops that we had out in BC. The Subhumans were talking to me about this, and they said, we had bell bottoms, and the kids here in Toronto had like leather jackets or army surplus stuff. They had cool boots. We didn't have these kind of army surplus stores back in Vancouver, so we didn't have a way to dress or to fit in, and we went back home.
Was Toronto?
And I was also thinking that the Young Lions, they also had a similar experience to that, where they were trying to get gigs with the Violetones and the other punk bands from that time, and they weren't getting any time with them. They were just like, oh, you guys are whatever, the new wave. You're not part of. They didn't consider them part of the punk scene, and so I think that's when you start also seeing a music definition of the next subculture, right? And so that becomes the next generation, where it's like they're rejected, and they're not going to sit down and take that. They're playing, they're making music, they feel like they belong, they want to belong, and I think that it was partially that rejection from their peers or the people that preceded them that sort of drove them and inspired them to create their own scene.
I just wonder if. You mentioned Vancouver and the hippy-dippy stuff and how it was slack, and I wonder if it's possible, I'm sweeping generalization here, but is Toronto a particularly angry city? Does Toronto have a particular chip on its shoulder that other cities don't have? I think of this from a sports fan perspective sometimes. We all saw it with the Raptors. I mean, half of the people were like, they're not going to win. Like even here, I mean, everyone was hoping they would win. There's a chip on Toronto's shoulder sometimes that I think contributes to some of the music and the culture that comes out of it. And I imagine these guys being like, they're all wearing tough leather jackets and jeans. What are they so angry about? Like we're free-loving hippies from the West Coast. Is that true on any level? Do you think Toronto's particularly angry?
Well, people don't like us. Like people inside
That's an angry
Canada,
thing to think.
So in Canada, people don't, generally they pick on Toronto, right? And I think there's also this animosity between Hamilton and Toronto. There was always that going on between the working class sort of steel town and Toronto being sort of whatever,
You're
Toronto
answering my question. Does anyone else want to speak to this, though? Like, does anyone disagree? No? Do you think it was angry or is angry?
I don't think it's particularly so. I think that there's definitely, not to get off topic, but you're talking about Hamilton. I mean, Hamilton's a city of a tenth the size of Toronto, if that, population-wise, and yet all the best punk rock was from there. But there's no good hardcore from Hamilton. There's a rock and roll tradition in Hamilton that is very real and very blue collar, and ironically enough, very New York in a way that Toronto maybe wanted to be. But I think the Hamilton stuff was, even though it wasn't hardcore, was kind of grittier and tougher. And Toronto was viewed as kind of being posers and people playing dress up and art school, I think Hamilton may be an angrier city than Toronto, but no one's ever heard of it, so it doesn't matter.
Well, in terms of
fighting words. Anybody from Hamilton here? Oh my God, love your city.
She'll see it.
Everybody
outside.
visit Granddad's Donuts. Best donut place I've ever been to in my life in Hamilton.
Let's go back to trash and Guelph.
I would also say
you took it a lot better than
Guelph needs a good donut place, I'll tell you that much.
But I
I'll
was
also
gonna
say
say,
that there is some good hardcore bands from Hamilton.
well, I was going to say though, specifically about being angry or like violence within the scene. We interviewed a guy named Paul Abrash, who was the drummer of Steve's band, and amongst other things. But when we interviewed him, he was from Windsor, and so he would see shows in Detroit. And he was scared shitless of going to shows there because there were skinheads, and it was just out of control, right? People getting their heads kicked in, it was craziness. And when he came into Toronto in '87, it was like kids skipping around a maypole or whatever whatever that phrase is. He was just like, wow, this is crazy. Like, you can go to a show and you don't get beat up. This is nuts. And part of it, what we cover in the book, so we have copies of the book here tonight, and we have a few of the first edition and also of the second edition. So if anybody's interested in buying one, we have both here tonight. But on the cover of the first one is Steve Goof. And when we were talking about why this scene didn't have a crazy skinhead scene like Detroit did, a lot of people said it was because of the Goofs. It was a self-policing scene, right? So the Goofs kind of had a war with the skinheads, and they sort of took care of the problem. So skinheads, if they came to a show, the Goofs would be there and they'd kind of march them out and deal with them, right? And because of that, and like we said, they also ran one of the clubs, so skinheads could go to the club, but you had to behave yourself, and they weren't putting up with the Nazi shit, and they weren't putting up with picking on kids in the pit, and they weren't putting up with that shit.
Right.
And so they stomped it out. And as much as the Goofs had, I guess, a downside, because they did also do damage to people in different ways. They took care of a lot of that skinhead problem, and so that let a lot of us just kind of be ourselves, and you weren't as afraid to go to a show as you would be if you were in Detroit.
Glue sniffing and heavy drugs as well.
Yeah, and they were against some of those things. Yeah.
Okay.
Aggressively.
Aggressively against glue sniffing and that kind of stuff happening. So.
And they started a punk run club, and they ran these booze cans that you could stay at, because sometimes you couldn't get home at night, right, after the shows, so they would basically be open for people to hang out, drink, and socialize, and
because Last Call was earlier back in those days, and
the subway wasn't running.
The subways weren't running, and like Simon was saying, there wasn't even Sunday shopping. It's like we were a pretty conservative city from that point of view. So booze cans was actually a pretty important part of the early part of the scene.
Yeah,
it's giving people a place to go after the show, and bands would be playing at there too. And sometimes the bands would be playing in a club,
you got a second show,
like a band like DOA or whoever, or Discharge or whoever was in town. They'd be playing a show in a club, and then the show would be over relatively early. They'd end up at a booze can, and some of the same bands would be playing there after hours.
Right. All right, well, I think we've gotten some context for the time. I think we should maybe home in on this book and why it's come to be and how it's come to be and the shape of it, the zine-like quality of some pages and the amount of information and the people. It's a really amazing and necessary undertaking. So first of all, thank you for this resource. I suppose we should begin with Sean and Derek, right, in some capacity in terms of, Derek, you were saying something about how this book came to be, I think, at some point?
Well, Steve was kind of touching on the fact that there were blogs. Steve had a blog. I started a fan page, or whatever you want to call it, on Facebook for the band I was in, MSI. And so I would post flyers and things on there, and it would always start a conversation, right? And so people would say, oh, I was at that show, and then the thread would sort of morph into, oh, did you meet that person at this place, or whatever, and the story would kind of tell itself. And at the end of all these posts, someone would always say, why isn't there a book about all this? And so
those suckers who said that.
I saw that a bunch of times happening, right? There'd be these posts, why isn't there a book, why isn't there a book?
I will say it's heartening that they went with book as opposed to an app or...
yeah, that's true.
A documentary, whatever. Like, they went with book. I like that.
Yeah, there was definitely why isn't there a book about this? And so after I saw this 3 or 4 times, Sean was one of the suckers that posted that, and I knew Sean.
You were like, why isn't there a book? Is that what you think?
Yeah, there's been so many great 70s books, and there was nothing on the 80s.
Seems to be collusion here that you ended up writing the book with him. Why isn't there a book?
Well, so back in the day...
But I also think that there was a number of books coming out about the first wave of the punk scene. So there was Treat Me Like Dirt that Liz Worth had written.
Yeah, amazing book.
Don Pyle.
And Don Pyle's book, Trouble in the Camera Club, and there was a book of...
Nick Smash, who's here.
Yeah,
Urban
Urban
Youth
Gone
by
had
Sam
come out.
Sutherland, yeah.
And
Well, I don't
Nick
think-
White's here. His book came out shortly before ours did on the early
Yeah.
post-punk scene.
And then The Perfect Youth, Sam Sutherland had written a book about the Canadian punk scenes. And, you know, we were feeling kind of like, well, we were a part of an amazing scene, and there was so much other things happening with it. And I mean, that's kind of why people were saying there should be a book about this, because there was so many stories to tell.
And I sort of, Sean and I were acquaintances back then. So the band I was in, Sean did a record label and he put out a compilation. It was a benefit comp, and our band was on that comp. So we had known each other
What was
from
the
those
comp
days.
called?
Progress.
Progress.
And it was a benefit for Tools for Peace.
For Nicaragua,
for
yeah.
Nicaragua, yeah.
Okay, okay.
And it was all Canadian, it was all Toronto bands, so it was a great Toronto compilation aside from that.
So, Derek, did you and Sean meet because of Sean's Facebook response to your post, or you'd known him?
We were acquaintances, but we weren't like good friends.
Yeah. Okay.
And so then I contacted him as a private message, and I just said, hey, what do you think about this idea? You did a zine before, I've done a fanzine. I work at a printing company. Seems like a thing, right? If somebody, and like the point of DIY stuff back then was, don't wait around until someone else does it, do it yourself, right? And so from that ethos, we kind of talked about it, and we said, like, let's just not wait, let's just do it. You and me, let's do it. And then friends of ours, like everybody you see on the panel here, they just kind of said, that's a good idea, I'd like to help with that. And even the way we funded this, like we had options to, like we were talking to publishers early on. Sean said, maybe we should talk to a publisher and go that route because it costs a lot of money to put things like this together. And so I said, okay, that sounds good. So Sean contacted one of them, and the first conversation was, you know what you guys have to do? And as soon as they said that, I'm like, I don't have to do fuck all. I'm going to do this the way I want to do it, and that's how this is going to be done. It's going to be done the way we know is right. We were there, and we're going to talk to every person that we know that was there, and we're going to put this thing out, and it's going to look, and it's going to feel and taste and whatever, all the things that we wanted to create a feel with the book. And I was talking to Rob earlier tonight, and he's going through this experience talking with a publisher, and they're doing their own book about flyers.
Rob Bowman?
Rob Bowman, yeah.
Hi, Rob.
P.S. A little announcement. His book is going to be amazing. So this book about, yeah. And so,
can we talk about it?
well, we can. I don't know enough to go into it. I just know that they're doing this book about flyers in Toronto, and it's over a period of like 100 and something.
1840s to...
1840 to 2000.
Wow.
It's a wide range of all genres.
I didn't know the
it's,
Philadelphia Flyers were around that long.
it's an amazing project that they're embarking on, but Rob was just sharing that he's working with a publisher, and it's challenging to get things done the way you want. And so we avoided that altogether, and we thought, how would we have put out a record or a zine or whatever back then? We would have talked to our friends, and we'd say, hey, what do you want to help out, and can you write some stuff, and can you interview someone? And then we would have said, who's got $50? And we all would have thrown it in a hat, and then we would have pooled our money, and we would have put something out. And then we'd say, how are we going to sell it? I don't know. I know someone. I'll send this copy to here and there and whatever. And so we just went the same route that we would have done back in the 80s. And we stayed true to that sort of ethos, and we all just basically pooled some savings, and we put it in and hoped that we could recoup our investment.
It's a really fascinating aspect, psychological aspect of punk that I've always related to, this notion of a social cohort that is pushing back against something or someone, some oppositional force, and that's always been the case with underground culture. And obviously it's manifested itself in the story you're telling. Like, you had to do it yourself because... Did you even let them finish the sentence, by the way? Like, you know what you should do? And you're like, no.
Yeah, pretty much. It was like, nope, meeting adjourned. Okay.
What if it was just maybe you should tie your shoe. Your lace is loose, you might fall. It might have been helpful.
But you know what I mean? But you're saying like we had to do it. We wanted to do it. We wanted to do it ourselves. I didn't really want to go the route of the publisher, even if they had have been interested, because it's like, I just didn't want somebody to tamper with the story. We're in the midst now, actually, just as a side note, we're in the midst of doing a similar type of piece now about the Toronto underground metal scene of the 80s. And we're going to do the exact same route. We've now, based on the success of this book, and people have seen that we can produce something that's pretty well put together, there is more interest from publishers. Yeah. But we've also kind of, we've just been like,
So who published this book?
This is self-published.
And it's called, what's your press called?
So UXB Press, Unexploded Bomb. is a song by Direct Action, and the title of the book actually just coincidentally is from a Direct Action song, Tomorrow Is Too Late.
Right.
And I felt that they were one of the best bands to come out of that scene, and so we definitely picked the song title as a bit of a tribute to them, and then the name UXB Press, I just always like that, Unexploded Bomb. It's kind of, it's what I felt like we needed to do is explode this music out onto the world stage, right?
This stuff was really powerful, but it was a flop, and no one ever heard it. It's an unexploded bomb.
Okay. Okay. Sean, you've been curiously quiet on the panel. It might be my fault. I don't mean to domineer.
It's all your fault.
It probably is. Can you talk a little bit, just in general, because you haven't been talking? Why did you want to do this book exactly? Like, what was it about this whole?
Well, to me, it was the same thing. Like, we'd seen all these great Toronto 70s punk books, but nobody had done the 80s, and it was something we knew. And, I thought, let's do this. We did this back in the day, and it made perfect sense. And we really wanted to make it feel like a fanzine did back in the day.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sort of like a yearbook, really, of like in the beginning of the book. Sorry to talk over you.
No.
That's what everyone's doing.
Sorry. At least I'm recognizing it. I'm apologizing.
Yeah.
But on the inside front cover, we wrote a little bit about, we kept hearing about a lot of people that hated their high school experience, and or some people didn't even make it to high school. And so we kind of wanted this to be, and it felt like at the time, sort of like a place you'd rather be than high school. You'd rather be with these people as friends than you would the people that you were going to school with. And so we were thinking about it like, why don't we make it kind of like a yearbook, like a high school yearbook feel? And so a few pages in, there's like this 2-page spread that has basically all those headshots, and that was like supposed to be an artistic sort of take on like a school yearbook where you'd have all those rows and rows of straight headshots.
Yeah.
The designers did that a little bit more artistically than the yearbook would do it, but that was meant to give it that sort of feel where you open it up. Simon's finding that spread. Do you want to hold it up for people? And where you could go through there and you could be like, oh yeah, I remember Lurch. I remember whoever, right?
I'm sure everyone listening to this podcast right now could see what Simon was holding up. That's great. Thank you for doing that.
It's awesome.
No, I hear what you're saying. This sparks a thought, and I don't know if you gave it much thought. This is obviously a deeply personal book for everyone on this panel who is involved. That distinction between personal nostalgia and actually doing a service to history, did that come up at all for you? Like in this, this is so meaningful to me and my friends, but what is the purpose of this book beyond that? Does that come up in conversation in any way?
It did. I mean, I think we were going as this inside baseball, some of this detail, but, even Derek's wife was reading the book and she was she wasn't part of the scene, and she went, oh, this is actually quite readable, this is enjoyable.
Yes,
so we knew that people were, that it could appeal to somebody. And same with me, like I've read enough books about other punk scenes that I wasn't part of or didn't know about, and I'm a music junkie, so I got pulled into the story.
So the impulse to not alienate, but it's weird when names are being dropped or you're like, oh my God, it's like a torrent of information because there were so many people involved. You've got to be careful in sort of explaining and contextualizing these things when you talk about them.
Completely,
right?
yeah. And we took the like the approach of an oral history, and the classic book is Please Kill Me, which is sort of sets the template out in a lot of oral histories. But we also, we'd seen books like Don Pyle's where there was lots of great photos, and nobody had married the two ever. We hadn't seen a book that had that oral history and had the visual history together, so I think we did something unique with that. Don's has some good stories in it, but it's not the same approach.
Right. I mean, it doesn't seem academic in a dry way, but this seems to me like this is a history book, for real. Like this, someone could teach a course with this book, if I may.
And we used literally 10% of what we had. We had
10% of what you had.
We had 50 people give us their photo and flyer collections. So some of the photos up behind us are things that made it into the book, and some are things that didn't make it. And we had so much stuff, and we did a ton of interviews with Steve. We did a ton of interviews on our own, and we had like 1 million words.
Yeah, there was over 1 million words transcribed.
Did Fran do most of that?
It was all Fran.
It was all Fran.
Thanks, Fran.
She's a fast typist. And
Tim Freeborn.
And Tim Freeborn.
Mostly mostly Tim.
Mostly Tim Freeborn, actually. And so we used about a little over 100,000 words in the book, but there's over 1 million transcribed. And we had over 10,000 images, and I think there was only about 800 or 900 that were used in the book.
So if I were on Facebook now, and this was a post, I'd write, is there going to be another book? Why isn't there another book?
There's been a bunch of people that have asked about that and said, why isn't there a second one? But, I mean, we could do 5 books, really, but we wanted to distill it. We didn't want to geek out to that degree of alienating people. We wanted to tell a good story, and we wanted to have the prime visuals that we thought really reflected what the time was like. And, yeah, we could go on endlessly about, here's another flyer, here's another ticket, here's another something, but at some point, the people that aren't like diehard about it are going to get kind of bored. But what we did do was we created a postcard set and a supplemental poster that came with the books. That basically on one side of the poster, there's about 50 flyers that didn't make the book that was from the first half of the 80s, and the other side was about 50 from the second half. So we got to show about another 100 flyers that didn't make it into the book.
Right.
So we did use some of that extra material.
There's been a couple of moments on the panel tonight where a few of you have said, well, obviously some of you will remember this venue or this record store from 40 years ago, which tells me that you think that there's a demographic for this book that might be the people that experienced it. Have you heard from younger people? Have you heard from people who are like, I had no idea, this is like an uncovered history?
Oh, yeah, I've had 20-year-old kids come up to me at shows and say, thank you for doing this. They're in the hardcore scene now. But it's interesting, we had a firm called Goods and Services do all the design for us for free because they wanted to be able to lay something like this out to win awards, and they have. They've won 2 design awards, and you've won a print award for this. And they were all young designers, and some of them were kids that are in the scene today or or just interested in music, and it was appealing to them as they were laying it out.
Right.
Yeah.
Has it impacted the way, I mean, this might be impossible to say, but have you noticed this sort of cycle of activity coming back? Has it ever left? Has Toronto always had this kind of activity going on?
Steve can probably talk to this best because we're one of one of the strongest cities for hardcore.
Still alive today,
right?
Kicking.
We started this by me asking about kind of the material conditions of Toronto during this time. It seems harder than ever for artists, for young people to have places to live in this city, to be able to afford it, to have venues that are available to them that aren't being turned into condos.
Sure, yeah.
Is that?
No, you're definitely seeing some of that. You're seeing some of the clubs now spreading further west, and not really east, but some of them are east. Some of them. There's like some DIY shows that take place in ravines, so they're field parties, but you're right and you're seeing a lot of clubs closing down, and it's more and more difficult. So when the hardcore scene was going on, it was sort of just outside of the central business district, if I could say that, and now it's like really far west and really far. In other direction, I guess it's more west and east.
And it's always sort of operated irrespective of.
And the record store, the recent record store, Faith Void, that was open for a couple of years. They were trying to be a multifunctional space, so they were doing punk film nights, and they were doing art exhibitions, and they were doing all of these other kinds of things because there wasn't really a dedicated space, and there was a need for it. And they closed down because they couldn't afford the rent. They just couldn't afford to pay it.
And noise complaints.
And noise complaints because they were doing shows there, yeah.
I guess one of the subtext of maybe the last line of questioning is, are there lessons for future generations of punk rockers in this book that you can think? Simon says, no. Simon shakes his head. No lessons?
Well, everything's just way too different now. I mean, the cultural conditions that led to this happening at the time we're just so removed from now that I don't think there's anything to take from it.
Although the Cold War is coming back.
Yeah, I don't know. Let's hope it stays cold. But
was that a climate change joke in the middle of it?
No, I don't joke about climate change. I don't mean that in a fatalistic way. I just don't. I think kids nowadays, punks nowadays, need to grapple with very, very different set of circumstances, there's different punk scenes still, just as there was then. And so depending on your approach, if your approach to punk is primarily a political approach, then you're not going to find much in here because you're dealing with a very different world and very different issues. If you're interested in music as primarily cultural or artistic or just musical, then you are going to find stuff in here because so much of punk right now is about essentially this ongoing Xeroxing of the glory years of 70s punk or early hardcore over and over and over again. Sure, you will find out about bands you should listen to copy, definitely.
But I mean, 70s punks.
But that's important. That's what
I'll take generic thrash over boring innovation any day, so I'm a fan of that. But as I say, it entirely depends on your own perspective.
I think there's different mediums, though, and I think people are getting creative with these mediums, and I think that DIY spirit is still alive and well. And you're seeing people taking technology like recording technology, and you're seeing bands like being able to just take ownership of that their distribution. So I feel like one of the lessons, certainly, the DIY spirit is still alive and well, and certainly it's in spades in this storyline here. And I think. I think there's also because I was thinking about the book and how the book came together. I mean, you were being a little bit modest by glossing over it, Derek. I think beg, borrowing, and stealing is how this thing got put together, and that resourcefulness, that just like not being told, I'm not going to be told how to do this book, and I know how this book is going to work. I think that is that's still alive and well, and is told in this story, in this book. It's not just the methodology, but it's also part of the storyline.
But that sort of thing, I mean, like the DIY impulse, certainly that's never going to go away, but it's not like 1983 owns the DIY impulse.
Well,
I mean, this is just a part of the human
well, that's what I mean.
condition.
But the 70s scene had their way of doing things, the 80s scene had our way of doing things, and in a way, like I would hope that the new generation has their own way of doing things.
Exactly.
So they can look at these examples for the 70s, 80s, whatever, 90s. But yeah, Simon's right. Like the set of circumstances is totally different. To a big degree, we're cavemen up here, right? Like we're not as attuned to the technologies and the things that are out there. So yeah, we would hope that maybe these books inspire, but that the kids now will come up with something that'll kick the system's ass even more than we did.
There's no limits having your music heard now. I mean, so much of the the political economy of hardcore was about getting records made and getting them onto people's turntables around the world, getting them into stores. That doesn't exist anymore. I mean, it does if you want it, but it's not important. It's not important to 99% of kids. You can record something on your computer at home, and it's going to be zoomed into everyone's bedroom at the click of a button.
But
that's how you get heard.
But so the mediums are changing, but some of the same things like networking and getting shows in other places, going to these scenes and doing these things. Podcasting is one of those things that we're sort of. I mean, you do a podcast, Creative Control. We sort of try and podcast our radio show. But I'm listening to Maximum Rock and Roll just finished doing their last publication. But their radio show, they do these remote radio broadcasts, and so there's sort of linking kids by doing these exposures to. It's sort of like these remote broadcasts are considered scene reports, like live radio scene reports, and those are fascinating to me. I feel like I'm still being inspired by what the kids are doing today.
I just want to say, so that I don't come across as being too crabby, I mean, right at the end of this book, I try, it's punk, but the very final part of the book was something, and I don't think there was any struggle with having this included, but I suggested this because we've all read a million of these books where this music ends the moment the author loses interest. And the last couple of pages of this book are a paragraph about everything going on in Toronto right now, what you should be looking into, what you should be exploring, and pictures of some of the most vital current acts. So, I view punk as having a living history, and I think that there's certain impulses in it that will hopefully never go away and that can, on an artistic level, continue to inspire people. That's a whole different question as to what political issues people are grappling with, or whether the specific modes of expression or modes of documenting and disseminating expression that were useful in 1977 or 1986 have a lot of meaning to kids nowadays, because I don't think they do. But that's just because technology's changed. It doesn't mean that the validity of expression and music making has lessened at all.
All right, well, I appreciate that, Simon. Thank you for that.
I just want to say one more thing about DIY.
I figured you might.
Of course. Sorry, I'm opinionated.
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
But I was thinking that DIY was one of the characterizations of between punk and hardcore, and I think it really did start with that first wave of the punk scene. A lot of those bands were trying to get signed, so like the Violet Tones were trying to get a deal. The Diodes did get a deal, and then that sort of went a bit south. But people were looking at those lessons and going, yeah, maybe that's not the way to go, kind of like the way Derek dealt with a publisher. And so you started seeing these hardcore bands, and they're like, yeah, we're not even going to try that. We're going to put out a cassette. we're going to do a different medium. So that's not like cassettes were, I mean, at the time they were kind of a medium but they were sort of like a one step down from putting out vinyl, right? And the punk bands, the hardcore bands were like, yeah, we're just going to take ownership of our means of production and do this stuff ourselves. And I don't want to underestimate it, but I feel like it's a defining character between punk and hardcore, and it comes from the punk scene. It's something that the hardcore kids looked at the punk scene and said, yeah, this is how we're going to do things now.
Okay.
And my usual line is that the first wave of punk was art school, and then hardcore was high school.
Right. That's probably accurate. I just want to suggest that if anyone has any questions in the audience, we can take them. We can have the panel field your questions. So think about that for a moment. Does anyone have any right now? Can anyone think of any questions they have?
I have a question.
Sure.
Hi guys. Actually, me and my friend here, we're from Ecuador, and we've always been seeing like New York, of course, and the UK has been for us an influence in the punk scene back home. But we want to know what happened. Why did you always say that like the Canadian or the Toronto scene never got the recognition they deserve? I mean, what happened? Where did that link to the world get cut?
It's a mix of things. One of them is in that early wave, we only put out cassettes. It wasn't until the mid-'80s that we start putting out vinyl. So record collectors aren't interested in cassettes. They deteriorate. And we had so many bands coming here that bands could play here in the sort of insulated world and not have to tour. Most bands maybe went to Ottawa or Montreal. Very few of them traveled across the country. And this is the same for rock bands. Canada's impossible to tour. It's impossible to distribute records here. So we didn't tour. We had all these great bands come here, and we just stayed in our own town.
Yeah, like Sean was saying, there were shows that at Doug's Club, for instance, you could have a local bill of 2 or 3 local bands, and you'd have 300 kids showing up. And so there wasn't really much incentive. I can speak from a band point of view. There wasn't really much incentive. We would go to the States, and we would go with some friends' bands like Sons of Ishmael. MSI and Sons of Ishmael hop into a van. We'd go down to the States for the weekend or whatever, or 3-4 days or whatever, and we'd go and try and play shows, and there'd be, 12 people would show up, and you wouldn't have money for gas to get home, and you're eating peanut butter sandwiches, and you know what I mean? Or you can stay home and play to all your friends, and there's hundreds of people showing up, and not that we got paid or anything, but also you didn't have to put out the money, or it was, I don't know, I don't want to say it was lazy, but you know what I mean? Like it was much easier that was more appealing at the time, and most of us didn't drive and have a van, so that was another hurdle. So there's all these kind of things, and you're just like, well, I could take a subway down to Doug's Club and play to 300 people, or I could figure out a way to get a van and go to Kentucky, which we actually did. Played in Newport, Kentucky at the Jockey Club to 30 people or whatever, 20 people. Right. And our drummer Tim had to rent the drums from, didn't you? Didn't you rent the drums from the opening band, Active Ingredients?
He was just really uptight about letting us use it.
Oh, yeah. So anyways, we didn't have a warm reception from the locals, and it was this kind of a weird thing. And then our second show on that tour, just as a side note, we were supposed to play in Ohio, in Kent. Was it Kent? Yeah, and we were supposed to play at a club called JB's, and we got there, and nobody had told us the club was closed. And so we're like, okay, so our second show of our tour, of our two-show tour, is also a bust. But on that time, it was actually pretty cool. We ended up meeting some people in Kent that we stayed in touch with for a long time. They had a house that was going to be demolished coming up, the Happy Hippie house, that was going to be demolished a few days or a week or something later. So they said, well, why don't you just have the show at our house? And so we're like, all right, what could go wrong? So we piled a bunch of bands in this house, and we played in a living room, and there were kids like jumping up and down. We thought the whole place was going to implode. There's kids going up the stairs. The banister got ripped off. It was something you would see in a movie. One of the amps blew up, and it was like smoke and it was craziness. It was like something you'd see in a movie. So, in hindsight, we look at these things and we said, it would have been a drag to do a lot of that. But in hindsight, we kind of look at it and go, it would have been fun to do some of that. And so, a lot of the bands didn't do that. They stayed home, they played here, and that's probably why the message didn't spread too far outside of the borders of the province.
I think there's also the fact that, DOA could just drive down the coast and play San Francisco and Seattle and Portland and LA and San Diego, We didn't have anything so close. But on the other hand, there's no great Toronto band. There is no great definitive Toronto band. So you have other big American cities like Chicago and Philadelphia. There's no great band. So you don't have like a Husker Du in Philadelphia or a Minor Threat and Bad Brains in DC or whatever. Like if a city has a great group that has meaning to people and creates a body of work, stuff will follow. And Toronto had a lot of good bands. It never had a great band. And so it never really congealed. I mean, I'm not even a fan of them, but the middle of Canada, you have Edmonton, and you have SNFU, who just went out, played and played and played, and were great live, and became a huge band because people loved them, and they overcame worse conditions than we had for touring. If you've got a band that connects with people and means stuff like that, it'll happen. I just don't think it was going to happen in Toronto.
Okay.
I also think that there was... like the scenes that we talk about, like London and New York. London had a record publishing industry, or a record industry. New York had a publishing industry. We were kind of a branch plan economy. So we were like the labels that were here were reissuing records from those scenes and from other places that were kind of going to be hits. But they were less interested in putting out our bands and
we never had that record label. Like we never had an SST in California or a Discord in DC. We had Fringe Records, and they were mostly putting out.
But that happened later,
Yeah.
but it was NRK cassettes. So it was like Brian Taylor had a record label or a cassette label, but like who was buying cassettes really? And I mean, it was just based on like that tape trading that we were doing that Derek had alluded to earlier. I mean, we were trying to write to as many people to find out about their bands as well. And then to showcase the bands that we were loving here, right?
Cool. Thank you for that question, all the way from Ecuador. That's great.
Thank you.
Just a little, because we're very curious about Canada right now and going into something.
Are you spies?
Yes, we are actually. But don't tell anyone, please. They're going to deport us really quick. So there's something interesting that I find about Toronto, because along with the punk scene, you also have the CN Tower coming up, and it's kind of late for a city to get there. Like the states, New York has the Statue of Liberty, but it's like in 1900s. You guys got it in the 70s. It's kind of really late to have that. How do you say that monument? You know, does that have something to do with the identity as well of the music, kind of like finding itself, because it still doesn't have a form, because the city is kind of finding itself as well?
So I was also an urban studies major, and the tallest buildings used to be, you could never build over top of churches. So at the time, the church was sort of the reigning ideology. Then bank towers became the reigning ideology, and the CN Tower was a communication tower, which signified sort of the media being the reigning ideology. And so in some ways we were the leading edge, but everyone also looks at it as a ridiculous phallic symbol, right? Anyway, I don't know if it had anything to do with buildings in the city or anything like that, but I do feel like, I feel like Canada wasn't, I think there was, in terms of, I'm going to go back to this market analysis, is that I just don't think these labels didn't think that there was a market here to put out this stuff, and they just ignored it. Like they just were like, yeah, well, we'll take your meeting, we'll pretend like we're interested, and maybe you'll get a recording, but we'll shelve it. I mean, that happened to the Second Diodes record. They just shelved it, and then later on it came out. There was, people who got involved in the record industry had bad experiences, and the hardcore scene was just like, we're not going there.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, you, sir?
Yeah, just quickly. What I find really striking is the flyers, in particular the artwork. Just some really compelling visuals. I was wondering if any of you could speak on who the designers were of those flyers. Was it one particular person? Was it several people? And what that process was like?
Yeah, there was a number of people, and we have a section on some of the artists in the book. So Ken Brown was one of the guys. Alistair, who was in No Mind, he did some of the amazing flyers that are behind us, those Kafka-esque flyers with the bugs. That Reed English, who was in Sudden Impact, did some amazing flyers. So we had pretty good flyer art. Most of the flyers were pretty bad, but we didn't include those. So
that's Reed's artwork there.
Yeah, that's Reed there.
My first show.
Yeah.
That's right, your first show, amazing.
Yeah. So we had some amazing artists in the city.
There's a lot of different artists. They all had different styles. Some of them drew, some of them, and then there was a lot of people who couldn't draw that would just do collage artwork. You would try and get an interest. Sometimes you would take an interesting graphic and try and make that the thing. You would use band logos, anything to try and get your attention. You were also putting them up on street poles, like the street corner poles, and you're trying to get people's attention as they're walking by, right? To trying to make it memorable as possible, so that people would take a chance and go to that show. So, I mean, I don't know. I think there was different ways of approaching flyers too. Some of them, like, were just cut and paste and stuff like that. But there was definitely some artists that people tried to get to do their flyers. They were so talented. Some of them went on to become tattoo artists and different things like that.
I think the best way to experience them, would be to pick up a copy of this book.
Yes.
If I might P.T. Barnum this at the end. No, I think it's true. It's a remarkable achievement and compendium. I mean, I'm astounded by it. I want to thank all of you for coming out to this tonight. I'd like to thank all of our panelists. And before we go, if you'd like to, please say one last thing about this book, or if you just want to plug something you're selling, I'd love to hear one final word from each of you. Why don't we start at the end?
We are working on a radio series called Tomorrow is Too Late, based on the interviews. Some of these interviews were 6-8 hours in length, so it's taking a while to do the editing. We've aired the MSI interview and one other one, Chronic Submission. Yeah. And I think we're working on the Micro Edge one next, because they just released a record. So
where will these live?
These live on our equalizingxdistort.com blog.
Okay.
And equalizingxdistort.blogspot.com. Maybe that's it. Just search Equalizing X Distort. It should come up. And that's pretty much, that's it.
Thank you, Stephen.
Fran, plug the records.
Speaking of Fran, I hope did you feel like you had enough to say?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
No, it's fine.
I feel badly.
No, don't feel bad. So working on this book has inspired me to start a record label.
Working on this book? You're starting a record label? And wow,
yeah.
Okay.
So so last year Simon and I started a record label called Urban Grandier. And we put out our first 2 releases in June. Malhavoc, their first demo.
Right.
That was only available on cassette.
Right.
And Slaughter, reissue of their 7-inch. So this book inspired me to do something myself, like self-funded, like working with local artists, working with flyer artists from the metal scene, Harry Tong, who did a lot of the Sacrifice flyers, and he did the artwork for the Slaughter record. So that's
awesome.
That's my
Where can people go to learn more about the label? Is there somewhere on the internet?
There's an Instagram account called Urban Grandier Records. And the records are available on urbangrandier.bigcartel.com.
Okay. Thank you, Fran. I appreciate
Thanks.
that. Derek?
Okay, so as we mentioned, part of the ideology of doing the book was to spread the word of some of the bands that came from here. We thought that they were pretty great, and we put out a 7-inch that came with the book. But the proceeds that came from the sale of the books, the little bit of profit that we made, we put that back in. It was important to us that we wanted to roll that into another project. So we, with Simon's help, Simon does a label called Ugly Pop. We partnered to put out the Micro Edge demo. So that was one of the bands that you've been seeing up on the screen. They were one of Toronto's first, skateboard kind of bands, right? And so we used the money that we made back from the books to put out their album. And so they recorded a demo in '83, a series of demos, and they went pretty largely unheard for all these decades.
Right.
And so we ended up compiling that and putting it out.
Cool.
So that was something that was a byproduct of this. And then once we get the money back from those records, we're going to look to another project and hopefully put something else out. I've also been working with Schizophrenic Records, who did a Toronto hardcore series where they put out an MSI record, they put out Sons of Ishmael, Young Lions, and now they've just done Chronic Submission and Direct Action. So they've kind of reactivated that series from a couple of years ago, and that part of that was motivated by the book.
That's amazing.
So there's a few things that have come out of that, but I guess the thing I would like to say to sum up is thank you to everybody that helped out with this, because everybody was so generous with their time, with their their collections and their stories and everything. It was amazing, and a lot of people we didn't know before this, and they just became instant friends. It's sort of like this: if you've got that hardcore passport, it's you're from the same place and you know the same same feeling, and it's immediate connection. And so thanks to everybody that took part and helped us to get this thing out.
Thank you, Derek. That's well said. Sean?
I'm going to plug our Facebook pages, and really, I don't think this book could have happened.
Not a good company, Facebook.
No, and that's the thing. I would have got off Facebook if it wasn't for these books, because really, it was how we outreach to people, and how we had people who were complete strangers hand over their photo collections to us and just say, "Here, take this."
That's amazing.
And it was mostly through, they had some connection to the scene, and some of them were people who were there before us. So we have the TO Hardcore 80s page, and we have a TO Metal 80s page for the new book. Really, those pages have been how we did this, and we got contributions, and we're able to find people through that page. So please check them out.
What's the Facebook page called?
So if you go to facebook.com/TO Hardcore 80s and /TO Metal 80s,
okay,
you will get to them.
Okay, and where can people figure out how to order the book?
If you go there, we have a list of what stores in Toronto have it, but we also have a Big Cartel store as well that is UXB Press and UXB Press Canada .bigcartel.com.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Simon, last words. By the way, it seems like you're wrong. Everyone was very inspired by your book. This book, sorry.
Well, I just want to say my role in this it's primarily an oral history, but I did the other writing that isn't like the text.
Editorial writing?
Yes.
Yeah.
And as such, I was very pleased that you said a minute ago that you thought you could teach a class with this book. I write a lot about music, and this has been the best thing that I've been involved with. And I think that this stuff doesn't get taken seriously enough. I mean, a lot of it is silly and extreme and everything, but at the same time, it changed a lot of our lives.
Absolutely.
It continues to do so. It's an important part of the culture, and it deserves better treatment than fleeting blog posts or, everything in media now is so dispensable and ephemeral and passing, and having the opportunity to print something like this with the quality that it was given by the people who printed it and the design people is very meaningful to me. And I just want to thank everyone who bought it and enabled serious punk history to keep going and to prosper, and for this stuff to get the recognition belatedly that I think it deserves.
Again, well said. Thank you, Simon. Thank you for that. My name's Vish. This has been a Creative Control podcast taping. So if you'd like, please check out my podcast. It's called Creative Control. I said it twice, just to double plug it. Once again, thank you so much to all the organizers here tonight and to all of you for coming out. And how about another warm ovation for this panel? Thank you.